Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you're enjoying your breakfast. I'm Ambassador Edward Juregin. I'm the founding director of the Baker Institute, and it's my true pleasure to welcome all of you to Rice University. First, I would like to thank my friend Dr. Ronald DePino, the president of MD Anderson, and our colleagues at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center for their very close collaboration with our team here and with Dr. Kirsten Matthews, the Baker Institute Fellow for Science and Technology, for organizing today's event. I would like to add that we at the Baker Institute are delighted that Dr. John Mendelsohn, the former president of MD Anderson, has become the Baker Institute's first Ellie and Virginia Simmons Senior Fellow in Health and Technology program. So our ties with MD Anderson are growing. Science and health policy are major topics addressed by the Baker Institute through our Science and Technology program and the Health Policy Forum. Our Science and Technology policy program is led by Dr. Neil Lane, who's here with us this morning. He's our senior Baker Institute Fellow, who was President Clinton's Science and Technology Advisor, and as many of you know, head of the NSF. And Dr. Kirsten Matthews, here, who provides a space for policymakers and scientists to engage in a substantive dialogue. Our hope is that policy will more accurately reflect and be more consistent with current scientific knowledge. Over the past 9 years, the Baker Institute Science and Technology Policy Program has researched such important issues as improving international scientific collaborations, funding of scientific research and development, and we have a stem cell policy program, largely with the state of Qatar. The Health Policy Forum, run by our Baker Institute Fellow, Dr. Vivian Ho, I believe Vivian is here this morning also, great, studies the ways in which economic incentives and government policies influence the quality and costs of healthcare. Needless to say, one of the seminal and most important issues on our domestic political agenda today. We are known for bringing leaders in science and public policy to Houston to engage with Rice students and faculty, as well as local business and community leaders. Today's program is part of the Medicine, Research, and Society series, co-organized by the Baker Institute Science and Technology Policy Program with the MD Anderson Cancer Center. This series, which began in 2008, is dedicated to educating the public on the important intersection of science, medicine, and policy at the state and national levels. We are particularly delighted that MD Anderson Foundation has decided to support this series with a major grant for the next 3 years. Given media coverage in recent years of debates over vaccines, family planning, and drug discovery and safety, this morning's event on science and the media could not be more timely. Many Americans use the media as their sole source for locating information on new health and scientific discoveries. They rely on science and health reporters to determine what issues are relevant and to explain complex research. If scientists want the public to understand their research, they need to establish better lines of communication with those reporters who cover these issues. Our discussion this morning will look at the relationship between scientists and the media from the science reporter's perspective. How can we create a better interaction between the media and scientists, especially in the medical field, to improve public health literacy? What can both scientists and science journalists learn about each other to improve medical media? So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ronald DePino, President of the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. MD Anderson has taken a leadership role in translational and clinical cancer research and has been named a top cancer hospital in the United States for 7 of the past 9 years. Ron is a fellow New Yorker like me, although he was born in the Bronx and not in Queens, and I'm not going to hold that against you. We belong to rival gangs, but that's not in our official CVs. Dr. DePino earned a bachelor's degree in biological sciences from Fordham University. He received his medical degree with distinction from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. So please join me in welcoming Dr. DePino to the podium.
Thank you very much. Taking my notes. You know, those guys from Queens, you just can't trust them. You get Queens, I'll get the Bronx. It's a pleasure to be here at this great university, and my admiration for you, Mr. Ambassador, is just beyond words. Today, we're joined by a very august group, one that is focused on an area that is of critical importance for our nation, the world, and the future. The stakes could not be higher, the opportunities not greater. This is a time in the history of science and medicine where there's been a confluence of technological advances that truly puts us in a position to change who we are as a species, to fundamentally impact on the human condition. The technological advances are breathtaking and allows us to understand life and disease on such a fundamental level that we can now begin to think in terms of preventing those diseases or curing them when they occur. And the challenges, the stakes could not be higher. The great four diseases, Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, and heart disease, extract a very significant social and economic toll on this nation and folks around the world. We spend close to $1 trillion just in those four diseases. These are diseases that are diseases of the aged, and thanks to advances in medical sciences, hygiene, vaccines, and so on, we have essentially doubled the life expectancy over the last 70 years, from 40s to now 70s and rising. By the year 2025, we'll have north of 1 billion individuals over the age of 60, and beyond the age of 60, you have this dramatic escalation in the incidence of the diseases that I mentioned. They essentially double every 5 years. You have a 1 in 2 chance of getting cancer in your lifetime, almost a 50% chance of having Alzheimer's by the time you're 85. So we have a great discussion ongoing in our nation, currently in the Supreme Court, about how to manage health care. But frankly, the most important opportunity lies in science. These diseases, if we focus our resources, our talent, our capabilities, these transformative technologies, we have the ability to have those diseases fall to the axe of science. We must make a decisive assault on these problems. Central to that is to educate the public so that this great democracy could influence our political leaders to get behind what we need, what humanity needs. They're counting on us. And so the communication that we establish, the education that we establish, both as scientists and as journalists, are extremely important for us to be able to move forward in a way that makes sense, that we intuitively understand, but this is not the natural course of the political process and policy. So we must inform, we must educate, so that we as a society can make the best decisions. So today I'm joined by an extremely august group of individuals who have devoted their lives to educating the public and communicating these breathtaking advances that occur each and every day. And I'll ask each one to come up in turn as I introduce them. First, Dr. Robert Buzzell. Bob, please take the podium. Robert is the NBC News Chief and Science Health Correspondent. He reports on, have a seat.
Thank you.
You could sit down, even though you're from which borough?
I'm actually from San Mateo, California.
California. California, everything loose rolls west, as I said this morning.
And I've lived in New York for 40 years. That's why I could talk like this.
So his reports appear on the NBC Nightly News, Today, Dateline NBC, and his career with NBC News has spanned more than 3 decades, and he's reported on a very wide range of subjects in the areas of science, technology, medicine, throughout the United States and around the globe. He has received hundreds of awards for his work, including 4 Emmys, the Alfred DuPont Columbia Award, the Edward R. Murrow Award, and the Gracie Award, and also received a coveted George Foster Peabody Award, for which he was recognized, quote, as exemplifying the best reporting on science and medicine, from transmission of AIDS to innovations in cancer treatment, to perceived dangers of cellular phones, to alternative modes of health care. Dr. Buzzell brings intelligence, understanding, reporting excellence to the task. He's an outstanding television reporter who recognizes when to speak, when to listen, and when to tell, close quote. Thank you very much for coming this morning. We also have Amy Burkholder. Amy, please join us. She is the medical producer for CVS Evening News. She generates enterprise stories, writes, produces, edits for correspondent Jonathan LaPook, who actually trained with me in Columbia, and I could tell you that managing Jonathan is a full-time job, so I'm deeply impressed with Amy's abilities, as well as Sanjay Gupta. Prior to joining CBS News, she worked as a medical producer at CNN in New York, producing medical stories for Dr. Gupta. She is an Emmy Award-winning television producer whose projects include Stand Up to Cancer and the CNN Cancer Symposium, Saving Your Life. Her reporting has taken her across continents, covering breaking news in the realm of science and medicine. And last year, she addressed the United Nations to discuss the media's role in eradicating non-communicable diseases. Thank you very much, Amy, for joining us today. Last but not least, our beloved Carrie Feeble. Carrie, please join us. Carrie became Houston Public Radio's first beat reporter for health and science, and she came to public radio after 10 years as a print reporter. She covers everything, from the ACA Act to Texas Medicaid battles to emerging clinical research in the medical center. She covers NASA, environmental issues, and research at our local universities. The Texas Medical Complex is the largest life sciences complex in the world, so she's got her work cut out for her. She broadcasts on KUHF, and her reports have appeared on NPR's flagship programs, Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and she was my first radio interview when I took the helm at MD Anderson, and it was really a great interview, one that I very much enjoyed. So thank you all for being here today, and let's just open the discussion now. I'll ask each of our panelists to make an opening remark, and then I'll get into questions. We'll go back and forth, and also amongst the panelists, you can respond to each other's comments as we go along. And then, if time permits, at the very end, we'll open it for questions amongst the audience. This is being webcasted, so I'll ask you to please wait for the microphone. Dr. Buzzell.
Thank you very much. This is Ambassador, Doctor, it was a great honor to be here. And I've been to the symposia here before. I have enormous respect for Rice University, so I really appreciate you having me back. Just briefly, I want to open with a theme that was something some of us were at a dinner tonight, and I won't bore you with all the conversations that were there, but one thing centered on a paper that recently appeared in Nature, very recently, a commentary about how much science that was created in laboratories could be replicated by drug companies, and it said that there was 50%, and we can argue about whether that figure is true. But more importantly, one of the authors is at MD Anderson, and another one was a former vice president of Amgen, said that there was a deep, flawed culture in science, of biological science right now in cancer research, in the sense that too many people want to tell a perfect story. And it's nobody in particular, and it's not due to any kind of avaricious motives. But the graduate student or the postdoc who wants his or her paper published in Cell or Nature to begin their career, the faculty member who's trying to get a promotion or sell an idea to a venture capitalist to start a company, heads of institutions who are telling stories to charities, to wealthy donors who want, everybody wants a neat, perfect story. And it isn't that way. Science isn't that way. It's messy and it's often wrong. And yet we have fallen into this trap. And I mention this not to be critical of science, but to say that I think that we in the media share a big responsibility for this. And I thought about this because the other day I gave a talk about the history of my own cancer reporting, and it started out with an interview that I did in the early 80s with Bob Weinberg, who was one of the pioneers of finding the genes, the actual cause of cancer. And it looked like a biology lesson on television, and it just explained what a gene was and why it caused cancer. And then I did a live interview with Dr. Weinberg, who is a very smart man and a great educator. And one of the things he said was that we can't expect that this is going to lead to a cure anytime soon. It was 50 years before we found microbes till we had the first antibiotic. And therefore, that was all true. And it was a long time, but it did happen until this genetic information became some cures. But my point is, when I looked at that story, I realized I couldn't get that story on television right now. No producer would let that on. It would be perceived as boring, didactic, and that the audience would flip the switch off. They want a perfect story. So every time we do, and I can't speak for them, but I suspect it's true, we do a story about cancer, it always opens with somebody who is on the verge of death, who is now okay, and been suddenly cured by this miraculous targeted therapy or whatever the latest thing is. So we have this need to tell a happy story, and yet the reality, while we are making enormous progress, and there's no doubt about it, the reality is often very different. And when I think about the role of science and the media, I think about this need to tell a perfect story and how much we should change that.
Thank you. I think we'll return to these points. Very rich topic. Amy?
Good morning. It's such a privilege to be here. And thanks to the very big thinkers such as Dr. Del Pino, it is such an exciting time in translational medicine. We see the new immunotherapies, personalized medicine, nanotechnology. But me, as a television producer, the question that I need to ask as I get the study, get the new information, and send it to as many people as I can, is it ready for prime time? And as Bob explains, we like to tell perfect stories. We like to tell the results of phase 3 drug trials. We like to show how something is working, and this is our challenge now in media. I looked at, in preparation for our event today, our last 6 months of reporting, and I sort of had to ask myself, what are we good at the network level in reporting, in medical and science reporting? And we are terribly good now at bringing new guidelines, preventive care, talking about, we've raised the questions about unnecessary testing, overuse. We're good at reporting on standard of care. We had a sort of shocking study not too long ago. 1 in 4,500 bladder cancer patients actually receiving standard of care, which raises important questions both for doctors and patients. We're good at adverse event reporting. We give important drug information, an example being recently FDA revoking Avastin, the big breakthrough in cystic fibrosis, Kalydeco. We're also very good at bringing, when we can get a series together, cutting-edge experimental medicine, that this is when we will sort of visit proof of concept or an early phase 1 trial. We're taking on drug pricing, as Dr. Del Pino did an interview yesterday with Al Jazeera, if I'm at liberty to say that. We're also getting good at progress reports, keeping tabs on technology, the big question now, safety of cell phones. But I get back to the question, is it ready for prime time with early science? How do we convince our editors that it is? our stories are largely character-driven. How do we find the right characters to actually bring the story home, make it compelling television? And can we understand it? We have to have a better communication with the scientists, and then we have to, I don't want to say, to bring a story to television, we have to bring it to a certain level where the number of editors who will read a script, read a piece, they have to understand it as well, so that's our challenge. So we hope to learn from you also how we can, when asked, is it ready for prime time, say that it is, and this is why.
Thank you, Amy. Carrie?
Well, thank you for both of you for starting us out. I think we all have similar concerns as far as the editorial imperative. We all get to find that compelling patient or character and have a neat, tidy little, if not happy ending, at least an ending. My particular conundrum is that I'm a local health and science reporter, so I'm always being asked, how is this locally relevant? Luckily, Houston has a huge science, medical, engineering community, aerospace, but I still think a lot of our listeners think of science as a national story. Studies do come onto the stage from all corners of the country and the world. And also, even within the city, I think people think of the medical center as this thing they're proud of. It brings our city prestige, but it's this other, until you have to go there, it's something that we're proud of, but it's not something we think of as part of our everyday life unless you work there. So my struggle is to sort of integrate what goes on nationally to what goes on locally, but I think both of you pointed out a big problem with this beat is my beat is health and science, and yet that seems to skew 80% health, 20% science, because the whole point, the whole drive to have a clean, wonderful story and narrative means that all of our reporting tends to be very homocentric. Health dominates because we're human. We all get diseases and we all die. So even the science stories that we do tend to have to do with human concerns, space exploration, what can humans do, where can they go, how are humans affecting or helping the environment. So when you get something very abstract, and these wonderful stories are happening at the medical center, but it might be an animal study or something with viruses, but if it doesn't have a direct human connection, it's very hard for me to sell the story to my editor. So I've got to be very creative in working with scientists and doctors and the people who work with them to think, how can we make this, use metaphors, use characters, and so forth. So, and that's something, I'd love to have a discussion about now as to how we can, expand the compelling narrative storytelling techniques to get people interested in things that are not so life and death, not so inherently dramatic, to bring attention to things that are important but can be kind of banal, like diet and exercise, healthcare policy, Medicaid policy, hospital politics, all sorts of things that are very important but don't seem so at first glance.
Excellent. I'd like to now start with a few questions for our panelists, and I'd ask the panelists to chime in as they see fit and add to the dialogue. And I'll begin with Dr. Buzzell, who has an extraordinarily unique perspective given his wide-ranging interactions with so many major events. You've reported on the very traumatic health issues that faced Japan in the wake of the tsunami, Haiti after the earthquake, and many other places. A very, very impressive perspective. And so you have this global view. And the question is, do you see the world getting better prepared for those eventualities and the impact that it has on the health of individuals who experience those tragedies? And from your experiences, what else do you observe that governments and NGOs are doing or should be doing to prepare ourselves?
Well, that sort of makes me king of the world, but to try to narrow that down, because there's a lot of things in there, I think that to get back, and I know you don't want a bunch of reporters here to complain about reporting, but it's very easy to cover a horrible tragedy like the Haiti earthquake and tell individual stories of children whose limbs were severed, but they were saved in for various ways, and all the deaths, and to avoid talking about why Haiti remains one of the poorest countries in the nation, even though it's 90 miles from Miami, or whatever the distance is. And it's very, during the Japan nuclear crisis, it's coming out now, but the idea that of constant renewal of a license, when there was increasing numbers of seismologists who said, look, the chance of this size of a tsunami hitting this planet is in geological time, it's happened before. And geological time in this case was less than 1,000 years, which is nothing, it's an instant, it's a flash. So, and the hardest thing there is such an irrational fear of radiation in the world. I think the biggest story that came out during that time was not just what a technological disaster there was in Japan, and it was just beyond belief, out of design accident, but the fact that when people in San Diego had learned that there was trace amounts of radiation in their water, and they have no way of knowing this because radiation is something that you can't see, you can't smell, you can't feel, so that there's this irrational fear of it. And I spent so much time in that story that arguing with the people that I work for, that I know we don't need to leave Tokyo. We're not gonna get, and Godzilla's not gonna come marching into the Ginza, and it's going to be all right. And yes, it's a terrible tragedy for the people who are around there, the 80,000 people who had to move out of the exclusion zone. But it's not a tragedy that's going to affect the world. It should make us think about how we regulate nuclear power plants, and the earthquake in Tennessee last year should make us think about how we regulate nuclear power plants in the United States, especially Indian Point, which has 6% which is near New York, and it has 6% of the world's population within its exclusion zone, within the United States population. So it's very hard when you're in this immediate disaster where there's so many compelling human stories to tell what's really going on. And of course, the greatest example of that is when we talk about hurricanes and floods, and God forbid I should say this in Texas, but we do need to think about global warming and its impact on climate and severe weather events.
So when you see these dialogues unfold, do you feel that the scientists are playing the role that they should be playing to help you communicate these stories? Do you feel that these government agencies are in fact listening, that they're actually presenting the story as it really is? Or do you feel that they're managing things in a way that are helpful or not helpful?
Well, there's a lot of theirs in there. Haiti, of course, was an enormous disaster because there was no functional government, and a lot of people coming in there and trying to do their best and running into each other, and an enormous amount of logistical problems because of that, and that's not an uncommon thing in that kind of place. The Japanese owner, the TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Plant, and the government were at odds and lying, and I think it's really fascinating. One of the fascinating things I learned about covering Japan was that despite the enormous damage to from the tsunami, which how many hundreds of thousands of people were killed in an instant, there is such a lasting, profound psychological impact on Japan, and a loss of faith in both their government and more so in technology. They just don't believe what they're told anymore, and it's a huge letdown.
Thank you. Any other comments? Amy, I'd like to ask you a question. You had a very important role to play in global health when you addressed the United Nations. Can you give us a comment or two about the advice that you gave the UN, and what non-communicable diseases did you cite as examples for challenges that we face?
As we know, we are causing much of our disease in this country and across the globe. Cancer, diabetes, heart disease. So I was invited to come to the United Nations by the American Cancer Society to talk about the media's role in actually getting the message out about these non-communicable diseases. And one of the points I made, I wanted to sort of share some understanding of network news. We have every night in our half-hour newscast a 22-minute news hole. So that is, it's pretty competitive, that real estate. And as we're finding, a lot of the disease, we just did a story this week, Bert Vogelstein, who has been studying genome mapping. And this very big study, he'd actually be upset if I also didn't cite his son Joshua. But basically, he said the predictive value of everybody going out and having their genome mapping for cancer, 24 diseases altogether, really, we don't know if it has that much value unless you have a family history. And it boils down to not so much your DNA, but the things that are influencing your DNA, the epigenetics, the lifestyle, the smoking. But as we know, lifestyle messages are a hard sell. So we need to figure out, as we get more and more information that 50% of cancers are preventable, how does the media make it relevant for our audience? I'll cite sort of a sad example. About 6 months ago, a study came out. It was a longevity study. And one of the shocking points of this study was women in third world countries are outliving some women outside of Jacksonville, Florida. Obviously, the big drivers are obesity, tobacco. But how do we continue to report the same information? Like, these are lifestyle-driven diseases. How do we make it relevant? And the other thing is, are these competitive stories? I'll share with you, working at CBS Evening News, every night after I go home, I get a report of every story that Bob's network reported, that ABC reported, and then the next morning we get a full transcript of everything that the other networks reported. So we want to be sort of dazzling. And does it dazzle to say, we're causing half of our cancers, don't smoke, get out, exercise, eat a healthy diet? So that is our challenge to, and that was the point I made, how do we make people care and hear?
And do you feel that scientists are playing the role that they should be playing in helping you package those stories and illuminate the things that should be done? I mean, there is this enormous impact that behavior has. Mm-hmm. It's not just about the genes, their genetic aberrations and epigenetic changes, but it has a lot to do with how we conduct ourselves.
Yes.
And so this is a critically important message, particularly given the burden of healthcare and so on. So the question is, what could we be doing to help the media to move this forward, move this important dialogue forward?
That's a very tough question because, frankly, we receive hundreds of emails a day with story pitches, ideas, information, and I don't get that many prevention pitches. So I do think everybody, it's almost sexier, to come up with a big drug discovery or understand a mechanism, understand some, a new immunotherapy. But I do feel there needs to be more of an emphasis on your end as the researchers, the policymakers, to sort of get that the prevention message out. And I'll give one example. I was actually on a phone call with CDC. We do conference calls, and we were talking about colon cancer. And there is a lot of emphasis on screening, which we know is important. But in that entire call, there was very little talk of prevention. And I think there needs to be a better flow on each side.
I don't want to take up Carrie's time, but I just want to say that I was really struck by, Ron, during your introduction, that every disease you mentioned of this threat to humanity is impacted enormously by obesity, including Alzheimer's.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, when we see our country getting heavier and heavier, and it's wonderful to have a place like MD Anderson and the rest of the Texas Medical Center and everything else looking for cures, but when you think about how many of these diseases shouldn't have happened in the first place, it's really an astounding challenge. And it has to do with what you can get your arms around, and people want to do what they can do. I mean, you know how to look for genes. You don't know how to get people to eat a better diet.
Right.
And
I mean, what would be great if we can develop social media that actually inspires, kids to get out and run around and play stickball and protect themselves from sun and during childhood and so on. These are all things that, just like we have done with seat belts in cars, if we can really get to folks early. Maybe the die is cast at the adult stage, but really influencing, healthy lifestyles relatively early is a potential point. But the opportunities that we have to educate through social media and other medium, I think is, something that we should try to harness, because from my perspective, I think that cancer control and screening in the near term are the greatest near-term impact that we're going to have on mortality for cancer. We will figure out the genes, develop the drugs, figure out the combinations, and so on. That will take time. But I think in the next decade, we can have very significant declines in mortality if we get this done. So if we can think about creative ways, that Nobel Prize winning idea that's going to capture the imagination of the public, that they get it, and they realize that this is something that they have to invest in, and it becomes part of our culture, then I think we can have a huge impact. So the stakes are very high. Carrie?
And to add to that thread, I think when we're talking about obesity, for example, as journalists, I think we need to be careful to watch out for the silos we put ourselves into, because obesity is much a story about urban planning and about transportation issues. And so if we follow, causation and influences back up the chain, we could be thinking, how can I tell that story of cancer prevention through where people live and how they're getting to school and work? And, if you go even further back, I think a lot of transportation problems in Houston go back to education problems. People's perception about school quality determines how far away they're going to live. So, I'm open to trying to think of ways, and hearing from all of you, of how we can, make a cancer story an exercise story that's also a, City of Houston planning story.
So, Carrie, I have a question for you. You've worked in a couple of different media, newspapers, radio, et cetera, and you look at the many mechanisms that we now have to communicate. Do you feel that one construct or another is more powerful these days than other? The advent of social media, electronic media, and so on, versus television, versus radio. What's your sense of, what mechanisms can we use, and which ones are really the way of the future, and how is it that we can best harness them?
It's a great question. I was first a health reporter at a newspaper in New Jersey, so I began in print, and I completely took it for granted. I had all this real estate. I had a lot of time to explain science and health, and whatever numbers I couldn't jam into the story, I would just carve out into a little sidebar, and I could use graphics, to illustrate things like cord blood transplantation, all sorts of visuals, and that I completely took for granted. And then I would have the doctors and the scientists and the patients. But when I moved to radio, it was like, going from writing a term paper to writing a haiku, or maybe a sonnet. But, 1.5 to 2.5 minutes is sort of my daily fare, unless it's NPR, and then I might get 4.5 minutes. So, and I think some of your deadlines, TV, can be even tighter than that, even your story length. So it really forced me to hone in on what's important. What is the takeaway? What is the essence? And sometimes I view my stories in radio as a little appetizer, or something, here's the takeaway if you only learn one thing about Medicaid in Texas this month or this year. This is sort of what you should, it's like putting a bug in someone's ear, and very interested, motivated people will go to the newspaper or will go online and find out more and research more. But, as you point out, it's all getting integrated. So, if people come to our website, then I can refer them to, a paper or a different outlet or other print outlets. And again, it's, with my theme of silos, it's not getting siloed. So, we're collaborating with the Texas Tribune, which is an online policy-oriented Texas news site. I collaborate with NPR. NPR is doing stuff on state policy. People are sharing salaries of reporters, so they're doing half online, half radio. So I see, one is not more powerful than the other. I mean, I might get someone's interest piqued. Oh, I hadn't thought of that before. I think that's one of radio's big advantages. You're captive in your car. It's just that primal storytelling. I mean, it's the most primitive form of storytelling. It's sitting around the campfire in caveman days and just telling a story. So if you can get someone that way, then they will go on their own and do more research and read a more fuller version if they want. So I see it as integrated.
No, Bob,
Could I add one
please.
thing that you need to know? As we report these obesity stories and single out particular food groups, for example, we just did a study 2 weeks ago. Walt Willett had a study out of Harvard about sugar, that men who drink just one sugary drink a day increase their risk for cardiovascular disease. And I'll tell you, the food industry, the chemical industry, they are very, very organized and activist. We get tremendous pushback in this particular industry, I should say this particular story, the sugar industry, saying sucrose is not, fructose is not high fructose corn syrup. So industry is poised to really sort of pounce and push back when we take on obesity. That's one thing that...
This is a huge issue. By 2020, obesity is expected to surpass tobacco as a major cause of cancer in this country, not to mention the other diseases as well.
But let me follow up on that. But I think also we shouldn't just despair about this, because there have been progress. The tobacco industry was one of the most powerful. It remains an enormously powerful force, and yet smoking, as bad as it is, and killing 190,000 Americans every year from cancer alone, let alone all the other things it kills people from. There are half as many people smoking in the United States now as there was a few decades ago. Mm-hmm. And so things can be done. One of the best books I've ever read is by a Harvard historian named Alan Brandt, called The Cigarette Century, about all the things that the tobacco industry did successfully, and it's going on now with global warming, about raising it out. You get one outlier scientist and you say there's a debate. Well, it's not a debate. That's not how science works, and it's a lot of it is responsibility of journalists. But in terms of industry pushing back too on obesity, I'll tell you a very quick story. I too have a son, Josh, who is a physician, graduate of Columbia, and also a very successful novelist, and I highly recommend his novels to you. I want to read them. But that wasn't my point. He was called by Wired magazine just last week, and because he's a good writer and a physician, they said, well, write a piece for us, anything you want. You pick the subject. And he said, okay, I got it right away. He didn't even have to call them back. He said, should internet addiction be included in the DSM-5 for psychiatric disorders? And they said, no, we won't touch that. Wired magazine, of course, all their ads are computer companies. They don't want to hear that there's such a thing as internet addiction. So the ways in which industry can fight back against very legitimate efforts to make us think about what's going on. I mean, there's a problem in television. We don't want to spend a lot of time telling people that one of the biggest drivers of obesity is people sitting on their butts watching television, as opposed to doing other things. And in fact, I think that sugar plays a problem, but the biggest factor in the era of obesity was the widespread use of television.
How much of
there goes my job right there. But I hope either Rice or MD Anderson has a position for me when I'm done here.
How much of your perspective actually enters into how you approach a story? Let's just say that you feel that obesity is not a problem. Would that influence the way that you would approach the dialogue in terms of how things should be done, or be religious about how you should attack soft drink companies and so on? I mean, how much of your perspective goes into an activist or a true, just simple, here are the facts, this person said this person said that? How much, in terms of the top journalists, do their perspectives and activism influence the reporting of the story?
That's a good question, excellent question, and the eternal question in journalism. Because every one of us comes from a cultural milieu, and we make certain assumptions about what we can say and what we can't. I am not going to do a story that praises fascism. But at one time in this country, and certainly in Germany, that would have been the thing to do. And it goes on in a much more subtle and obviously smaller ways, where obesity isn't fascism, and I'm not relating the two things at all. But I'm just saying that we all have a background, a set of assumptions that we come from, and we have to be very careful about how much that influences what we're saying. The problem with science reporting, which is the subject of this, is that there is something called science, which has to do with replicating experiments, and it makes for a very wonderful little universe. The problem is that there are people out, one of whom was put an amendment, who was running for president, one of whom put an amendment in to try to make creative design, intelligent design rather, a substitute for evolution in the classroom, and that's constantly going on in Texas and in other states, and how to separate those things out, and what if I was a very religious person, and would that be in conflict with what I report? I can't answer that, and that's why it's very good that everything that we do is a collaborative process. I mean, and one of the problems with the internet and people just writing blogs is that there's no collaboration. A lot of it is just people's opinions and screaming and yelling, and without anybody thinking about whether this makes sense.
One of the things that you touched on earlier in your opening comments, Bob, related to the issues of how we develop drugs. And you had written this very highly regarded book on Herceptin, obviously a game changer, major drug, one of the first targeted therapies that has really helped save a lot of lives. At the same time, it's been estimated that for every 100 patients we treat, only 6 have a survival benefit, so on and so forth. You talked about the replication of data, et cetera. So from your perspective, because you interact with the academic sector, the biotech sector, the large pharma sector, FDA, and so on, do you feel that there's enough communication, enough that the drug development ecosystem in cancer is in fact coordinated, or are there things from your perspective as a journalist that you think need to be optimized, and what would be the role that you would play in trying to influence and optimize a situation?
For those of you who don't know, this is the ultimate setup question, because Dr. DePinto's very, very noble role here at MD Anderson is to do just that, to try to get things coordinated. The main lesson that I learned from really getting deeply involved, as much as you need to do to write a book about drug development, is it is one of the most chaotic processes you can possibly imagine. It's so chaotic and so random that and disorganized and cost ineffective that it's almost impossible to imagine that a goal that society wants so much, which is a treatment for breast cancer that's effective, given no matter how many women it helps, could be done in such a haphazard way. And at the time when I did that story, Genentech, which is now making many billions of dollars off that drug and the other cancer drugs, was trying to get out of the oncology business. It didn't see it as a future. It didn't believe that a drug that helped that few people could actually be a useful product. And now they're the avatar of biotechnology success, and their oncology division is by far their biggest profit driver. But I got involved in that story, and I'm not going to go on with this, but I got involved in that story because I've been long looking for the first gene that would translate into a treatment, and the phase 3 trial was actually advertising because nobody wanted to enter it. It was just stuck in the water, and the whole thing was a complete mess. But at every step of the way, you see this just arbitrary decisions being made without coordination, and competition between companies and government regulation, and everything doesn't. In fact, almost everything works wrong, would be the way to sum it up.
So, Amy, you mentioned the role of scientists, your interaction with scientists in your comments, and I just wanted to get a perspective from you that is of interest to me in the scientific community, and how comfortable you are in interacting with scientists. Is it easy to get scientists to agree on an interview? How would you characterize the scientists that would become your go-to person that you feel would really be helpful in helping you identify stories of interest, shepherd those stories to the right level of interest, so that you can effectively communicate them? So tell me a little bit about your interaction with scientists and how you reach out into that community and effectively bring information into the media.
I guess I'll start with a little boast. One of my go-tos is Dr. Francis Collins, head of the NIH, because he, I guess the key ingredients would be accessibility and to be able to explain very, very complicated things in a way that I can understand and then report. In terms of, I have found tremendous cooperation within the scientific and medical community in terms of people wanting to get their eyes on studies, respond to studies, give honest feedback to studies. But one of our biggest challenges is we have to understand how everybody is incentivized. And I'll give one recent example of something that I found very disturbing. It was a meta-analysis coming out in Lancet talking about, is aspirin preventive for cancer? And there were a lot of holes in this analysis. They didn't factor in some of the big actual clinical studies here in the US that found an aspirin a day really doesn't have a benefit. But it was widely reported. And then in the small print, if you went online, you saw that most of the people involved in the study were actually getting money from Bayer and other pharma. So it's very important and helpful to us. Don't surprise us. We need to know who you're involved with, who you've consulted for, who you receive money from, and then help us put it into appropriate context. Bob and I would never reach out to one source on a story. We reach out to multiple sources. But overall, I guess the key criteria would be help us put it in the proper context and help us understand where you're coming from and your interest in having the story told.
Do you feel that scientists in general resort to hyperbole, just based on your experience, or are they pretty much straight shooters? You know, what's your general, you know, because you do speak to quite a few folks. I'm just curious as to how your experience has translated over time.
I don't know if I would say hyperbolic, but I would say obviously if a paper is published in an important journal, there's a good deal of excitement. They want to impress upon you how important this piece of research is. But I do think some of the scientists just can't help it. They speak a certain language, and it can be far more complex than it needs to be. But it does go, I guess my final answer would be it goes a very long way to be able to, you know, strip it of the bells and whistles and just give us the straight facts to help us put it together.
So Carrie, how do you, given the volume of work that goes on in our community, how do you keep up? How does somebody like you keep up with what's going on? What sorts of mechanisms do you use to keep your finger on the pulse of what's emerging and so on?
A lot of you in this room. I see a lot of people who email me and call me and, even just, hey, I want to get to know you and tell you what we're doing at our clinic or at our hospital. A reporter is only as good as his or her sources. So, yes, the pitches come in, 95% of the pitches get deleted right away. And some of them get looked at in a phone call, and some sort of sit on the back burner because they do tickle something in my brain, but I don't have time to pursue it. But then I often do go back to it. So, I rely on the community. It's difficult, but I do, I am going to go back to certain organizations that have shown that they understand that, the scientist or the doctor, they want to tell the story, they trust the media. Usually once I have done a story, then that trust is there and we can go forward. But a big problem I think with local reporters is that, if a doctor, researcher has been burned one time and felt that another reporter 10 years ago got it wrong, then they never want to talk to the media again. So, I sometimes try to repair our reputation and say, hey, give us a chance to tell the story. I find that scientists are not hyperbolic. They tend to be, if anything, too understated, cautious. They want to make sure that you're going to stick to exactly what the study says and not go beyond that. And I appreciate that, but when I'm doing my background research, but when I sit down for the interview, I'm looking for someone who is excited about science and what they're doing. And because science is exciting, and I think, it's my job to sort of help, however tired the doctor is after a long day of seeing patients, or the researcher after doing 10 other interviews to get them to rekindle that enthusiasm in themselves, because I think, at least for NPR listeners, they're generally curious, they're lifelong learners. You know, they get that science can be a great story, but it needs to actually be in the voice, in the tone of the researcher, you know, why they've committed 20 years of their life to this. So I'm always looking for those people.
We've talked a lot of, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go
I
ahead,
just
Amy.
wanted to add, because you brought up the issue of getting it wrong, and sometimes it's just wrong. And one of the problems now with the internet, I don't want to name names, but the particular story a couple months ago, a discovery in New York in the Alzheimer brain, the tau pathway, and it was reported that it spreads like an infection. And there was a story in a major paper, and it was wrong, but then you find that same story and the same ideas in 5, 6, 7, 8 articles in Google News, and that is a problem and hard to correct.
Yeah, very hard. You know, we've talked a bit about the scientist and the role in communicating to you, and how what makes a good scientist a great resource and so on, or not. Let's put the spotlight on the journalist. As a scientist, I have interacted with quite a few journalists, and I could say that some are more honorable than others, professional than others, that really speak to the guiding principles that they learned as they were being educated as journalists. I will say that the New York Times, which is considered to be, one of the, if not the print medium, has, at least one individual who I revere, and another who is at the opposite end of the spectrum, and this is a widely held view in the scientific community. I'm curious as to whether or not similar discussions go on. And I'm not talking about the New York Post, sorry. But I'm talking about the level of the Houston Chronicle, New York Times, and so on, Washington Post, et cetera, and that level, where there is, at that point, which is a very, very large stage and very impactful, still has, folks that are viewed as being uneven in their reporting and can create a lot of damage as much as good. So what kind of dialogue goes on at your level amongst professionals as to whether or not you should try to provide feedback or influence those individuals, or is this just a certain understanding that you don't criticize other journalists, et cetera?
Well, the one individual that works for the New York Times, as you mentioned, is a subject of constant discussion and anxiety, angst for us as well as for you. And I've had discussions with people who have edited her, and I found that sometimes she was pushed to do stories even beyond what she wanted to do, because the New York Times is not above commercialism and trying to sell its papers with sensational headlines. But we don't have those kind of discussions because there are so few of us. There are so few people who are on first of all, newspapers are almost gone, except for the New York Times and a few others. And the ones that are still there have very few, if any, dedicated science reporters. And one of the biggest problems is that a lot of times a very complex story will be covered by a general assignment reporter who covered a fire or a murder or City Hall the day before, and comes to MD Anderson and wants to know about a very significant discovery, and the poor scientist is talking to somebody who doesn't know what DNA is and doesn't know what a gene is, and that is a much more severe problem than these gradations. Now, obviously, the New York Times sets the agenda because it has such a standard of excellence that's widely known, but when they make when they make a mistake, it gets widely amplified. But that's the least of it. Much more of a problem is that because of a lack of caring and a lack of resources, there aren't very many people who know about science at all. I mean, you don't have to be trained as a scientist, but like I am, but you need to at least be immersed in it, the way somebody who's covering City Hall will get to know how the city government works after a while. And in terms of how you people deal with us, or will you deal with the media, and that, of course, is a very plural word. You will learn, and people like you and others, and other top scientists soon learn whom they can trust. You may be burned once, but if the same person comes back, you're not going to talk to him or her if you don't really have to, because you're going to know that there's a good chance of misrepresentation. And it's just like the question to Amy about who we use for sources. We get to know people that we know and we can trust their opinions. You need to get to know reporters who will get your message out in a way that you think is truthful.
Amy, what Bob just referred to is this just staggering complexity of science, the need to really be well informed and educated so you can really identify the right stories and so on. Another challenge that I think we face, even if you are very knowledgeable in the space, are the challenges of the space permitted, the time permitted, so that's another dimension to this. How do you deal with that in your different media? To be able to effectively communicate something? What are the approaches that you've used? How much of an impediment is this to truly get the story out in a way that's effective, educational, impactful?
Well, at CBS, it's 2 words. It's called web extras. The average evening news story runs probably a minute and a half or 2:30. So what we have started to do, every story that we do for the network newscast is then turned around and lives in perpetuity online, cbsnews.com. And what we've started to do, if we sat down and interviewed you about cancer drug prices, we would try to put the entire interview online. So having that web space does allow us to provide more content, run potentially whole interviews, and then also, in terms of getting it right, we as television journalists, we don't have the pressure that newspaper reporters do to use words or phrases to get above the fold. That's sort of their, top page. But we do, we carefully vet our content, particularly when we do complicated medical animations. If I had a scientist who we interviewed for the piece, I would go back to them and have them carefully vet the animation, the language, and potentially parts of our script. When we do get it wrong, we try to correct it online. And then we also have, people can blog. So I had an interesting conversation last night, to understand how the public is receiving this information. We do get some very sort of in-tune, smart blogs, which carries on the conversation that way.
So, but there, in general, with the whole social media, et cetera, and you raised this, Bob, there's really no checkpoint. There's no quality control and so on. And the question is, how much of that is really harming the news, or your ability to really communicate the story that is true? Obviously, you have revered institutions that you work for, NPR and others. That carries a tremendous amount of weight for those of us in the public. But it is an enormous challenge. Is there anything as journalists that we can be doing that could in some way control that dialogue, which is not necessarily accurate? I mean, it's an impossible situation as I see it. But is there any way that the public can be informed in some way that these are reliable news sources, they have their facts correct, there's quality checking, so on and so forth? Is that something that is of concern to journalists? Is there some way that we can approach the problem?
I think if you
Barry?
figured out the answer to that, you would be hired immediately by Google and the New York Times. I mean, you're right, the internet is uncontrolled, no one runs it, can't control it. Twitter, you can do a perfectly valid story and people can misinterpret it and retweet it. And I mean, it's sort of a horse that's out of the barn, I think. So, I think resources in journalism need to be dedicated to kind of at least getting on the horse and trying to stop the bucking. Sorry, it was just rodeo season here in Houston. But, having people monitoring where your stories are going, maybe how they're being cited. We don't have those resources at our station. In fact, we don't do these web build-outs that you talk about, I think would be very valuable, because people do come and there are hits on my stories after they've aired, but often just links, and not a lot of extra information. So, but I mean, as far as Twitter and that sort of, anarchy out there, I mean, I think there need to be dedicated editors who simply monitor that and try to respond. I mean, NPR does have that type of function to a limited extent, and, I've been, I don't always pay attention to reader comments, but some listener comments, but sometimes, an NPR editor said, hey, listen, jump into the comments yourself and respond. And, you're an authoritative voice because you reported the story, so, you can be in that mix and respond to any misinterpretation. So I enjoy that, and I think we should do it at the local level.
Well, to amplify what Amy said, the internet is not all bad, and it's helped us a lot, because a 2-minute spot is about 500 words, and if any of you can think about saying something in 500 words, including the quotations or AKA sound bites, you realize the constraints that it is. But that's that's a battle we fight. But now, whenever I do a story, if the journals allow it, and they usually do, we have a link to the actual research, so that the people who are interested can actually read the original research. We put in the entire interviews to the extent possible, so that you see an unedited version of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to write a longer newspaper-like version of it to try to get all the facts out. Now, everybody who sees it on the news doesn't go, but with diseases, people often do, because when people care about a specific disease story, because it's usually because it's affecting them or their family, they will go searching for deeper, more information, and thank goodness we have this resource to allow us to get it out that way.
So, Amy, you also referred to this resource. You guys obviously know what your viewership is, and the universe, millions of folks. How often do individuals, in fact, go to the website and avail themselves of this type of information from your experience? Is it 0.1%? Or is it growing? I would assume it is. But is this something that's really being exploited by the public to really understand and dig more deeply? Are they inspired to actually pursue this medium to truly understand what's going on behind a story?
My answer would be an unquantifiable yes. We do know that we have tremendous viewership online, that viewers are being driven online. I don't have a number for you, what percentage that may be. But one thing I did want to add, what has become tremendously valuable to me as a medical journalist is the Twitterverse. It's remarkable. We just came off AACR, going into ASCO. So much information now is tweeted and retweeted, and I just got a story tip from a tweet, some very early research coming out of Stanford that I would not have seen had it not been on Twitter. So that is, we're watching, and it's a great way to pass around links.
Terrific. I have a fun question. Maybe begin.
But they've all been fun up to now.
We hope for you.
What is the most impactful story scientifically that you feel you've covered in your career? And I'll begin with Carrie. You could, of course, mention the work that's come from my lab. Feel free.
How do you define impactful? Most listeners, or?
No, I would say that you feel is the most important story that you covered because it really was a seminal, discovery in the history of science, and that you really, it had an impact on you also as a journalist, and because you were in the moment, you were able to communicate this historic moment, the landing on the moon type of moment in science that you covered in your career.
When you speak of impact, I immediately think of, policy stories I did that, sort of got politicians up in britches, and, I did some of that in New Jersey and a little bit in Texas. But, to take up your challenge to talk purely in scientific terms, I would think a story I did for the Texas Heart Institute was a really exciting story to me because it conveyed the pure storytelling power of science. And this is a story of two doctors at the Texas Heart Institute who are creating a new type of artificial heart that doesn't beat, it doesn't have a pulse. It's just spinning rotors. Some of you may have heard about this. I did a story for NPR on it, and it sort of broke all the journalistic rules of when you should actually get the story ready to broadcast, because it wasn't in clinical trials. It was highly experimental. It had only been implanted in calves, and one man who did live for a month and died of unrelated causes. So I think clinically it was very encouraging. But I was actually getting married when all this happened. So I came back to town. The story was already done, and the man had died. So there wasn't that patient to interview. It was a little unclear how many years this type of, pulseless artificial heart would take, but, the scientists, doctor scientists that I worked with were great storytellers and really gave me the time to sit down and talk about this in an almost history of medicine pullback point of view, where we could talk about, pumping hearts versus other types of pumps that engineers use, and how, this is sort of exploding our whole paradigm of, why does a heart need to pump if it's going to be artificial? That's just our own paradigms of, what artificial organs must be. Let's just go with what works efficiently from an engineering point of view. But I think it made a great story. Anyone could understand, because everyone thinks of the heart as something that pumps, and I was sort of challenging them to think of, maybe our technology is taking us into these new non-poetic directions, and we're going to have to really even rethink our metaphors and so forth. So, NPR did say, look, you've got to have a human element in this. You've got to have that voice. The patient has died, but I was able to interview his widow. So there was, the poignancy to the story, that high drama was in there. But I think for me, the larger story was to tell my listeners, this isn't just the next medical device. This is a paradigm shift of what are medical devices and what can we expect from them, and how can they sort of shatter our thinking, and so that was an extremely interesting moment to me, to see how a device story could really be about sort of the philosophy of the body in a way.
Amy, how about you? Your most special or important story that you feel you've covered?
I think it's an untold story. We're eager to do some work with you. We just recently did an Innovations in Cancer Care 3-part series, one of which was a DCIS, ductal carcinoma in situ vaccine. The great hope that a therapeutic vaccine could actually be a prophylactic vaccine. We got tremendous response to that. And also we, with Dr. Jose Pasalga, meeting a woman with metastatic stage 4 breast cancer who had little hope of survival, taking an early phase 1 drug, and we saw her scans and just a dramatic change in tumors visibly gone, and we got tremendous response to that. I would say something that was personally most satisfying happened within the last couple months with the cancer drug shortages. We took on Doxil, and then when with the methotrexate, what has been satisfying is in reporting these shortages, obviously I don't think anybody thinks anybody who needs a critical drug to survive should have to fight to get that drug. But it has enabled us to shine a light on the process. We interviewed lawmakers involved, Senator Klobuchar, Collins, there's similar support on the House side, and yet legislation to try to avert these drug shortages has languished on the Hill for over a year. So now we're going to head to the Hill and start asking people why, talk to Dr. Homburg about all the issues involved with drug shortages. But to see the media can sort of, sometimes we play that advocacy, activist role, and I think
well, on behalf of the patients and their families, thank you. Bob, how about you?
I was very privileged to be the medical reporter for NBC at the time when the disease that's now called HIV first appeared. And because of my own background in it, and immunology, and because I knew a lot of people at the CDC and in the New York City and San Francisco health departments, I was able to start reporting on it before it had a name. And it's astounding and I think very humbling before Mother Nature. We're talking about this at the table here, to think that a disease that when we started reporting on it had a few dozen known cases has now infected 50 million people in the world and killed 30 million of them. And it still raises just astounding issues of access and where we go next, and in many ways. But I've done, because of the computers, you can tell this right away, I've done 4,500 stories for NBC. And I've done a lot of other things, but that is always going to be the thing that sort of, I think, categorizes how well I've done or how poorly I've done.
Yeah, I was an intern in 1981 when this whole thing broke. In fact, Mr. Brown, I was a resident on that case. So he was considered to be the seminal case, and it was an interesting time. These were fascinating cases, rare infectious diseases and so on that were emerging in these individuals. And blood was flying all over the place as these individuals coded. We were unprotected at that point. It's amazing that more tragedy didn't unfold for the healthcare providers, but you got the sense pretty early on that this was an historic event. And there is an example, in my opinion, as a physician, where our government leaders misstepped. There was not as much, you couldn't say the C word, right? There was not as much activism as there should have been. And so as a journalist, did you feel at any point that you really needed to say, this is not the approach, this is something that is going to escalate into an epidemic? Do I have a responsibility? Did you respond in any way to that crisis to try to shepherd reasoned thinking from a public health standpoint as a journalist?
Oh, there was no question about it. And if the idea hadn't occurred to any of us who were doing it, one of the things that characterized AIDS from the very beginning was a very powerful activist community, and a lot of extraordinarily accomplished mostly young gay men who were out there bringing up the issues at the very beginning, and AIDS activism set the standard for breast cancer activism and other disease activist groups to take a very strong role in saying, look, this is our bodies and we're going to have a say in how you treat us. So even if I wanted to avoid the political issues, I couldn't have avoided them because they became political. They became political very quickly. So yeah, that was part of the fascination.
As a cancer physician, I see similar challenges right now. It's very frustrating for me to have what is a complete toolbox of capability. I think we have a line of sight to actually decisively conquer this disease. And our nation has never put cancer research as a national priority. It hasn't. At the level of resources that it devotes, given the magnitude of the problem, just isn't there. And I think if the public truly understood right now what was possible, as opposed to 10 years ago, but the confluence of technological capabilities that we have, and that our nation's leaders were not seizing the moment and taking advantage of our abilities to move on this disease, I feel that the public would be running up the steps of the Capitol with pitchforks and torches. I mean, I think that this is a very important, it's another moment in history where we can say seriously that we're in a different space in terms of what we can do for these diseases, yet funding for research has declined each year since 2004. And the problem has only gotten worse. I think the dialogue that we're having of bending the healthcare curve is about efficiencies and managing the system, as opposed to actually addressing the issue of what causes it and how is it that we can actually deal with the disease.
But that gets back to the entire issue of whether money would be better spent finding social strategies to prevent the 50% that's theoretically prevented, or to spend more money in your lab.
Both, I would say. I think you need both. I think that you don't want to simply ask, what is the magic elixir to cure advanced diseases. You would prefer to actually not have these diseases occur in the first place. Vaccines, as Amy mentioned, early detection. In Germany, an aggressive screening program for melanoma just over 7 years led to a 50% reduction in mortality due to melanoma. There's no drug right now that we can give an advanced case. that would have that kind of impact on mortality. So I agree 100%. But we shouldn't have to make these choices or decisions. Should we have more treatment and research, or should we have more cancer control? These are things that the public is expecting from their leaders, scientists, journalists, policymakers, legislators. And I think that we need to figure out ways to educate the public so that they can exert their judgment as to where is it that they want the investments of this nation, which is, the world's counting on us to move things forward. And so if not us, if not Houston, Houston, we have a problem. If not us, then, who?
One, just quickly, and I don't want to dominate this, but if you look at the average congressperson's desk, just forget the calls to balance the budget and destroy Medicare and Medicaid, which some people are advocating, and all of that. Just look at Alzheimer's, for instance, compared to cancer, where you've got no clue. I mean, you've got a few little bits of things. But look at autism, which is got all kinds of social components, which we don't have time to get in here. And look at the whole fact that there's an Institute for Complementary Medicine at the NIH, which is totally due to political pressure on members of Congress from people who think that herbs cured them or cured their family members. And then you say, well, and a federal budget that many people see as out of control. Yeah, I don't think, and I mentioned Mary Lasker before, and Mary Lasker was a woman who caused Richard Nixon and Ted Kennedy to declare a war on cancer in 1971 when it was Saul Spiegelman, who may have been one of your mentors or teachers at Columbia, who said this was like trying to land on the moon without knowing the laws of gravity. There's a balance. And we can't do everything, and when you say what crusade should a journalist take up, it's a very complicated question.
Well, that was excellent. I've run out of questions. Do we have time, Dr. Matthews, for a few questions from the audience? A couple? Very good. So, questions? Let's wait for the microphone so that you can be heard on the webcast.
"20 years ago, we never dreamed that smoking would become almost socially unacceptable. I'm stunned at how good the response has been, even though 50% of people still smoke, but it's down.
Well, it's down to 25% from 50%.
Okay, good. I heard your comments about obesity, and when you go to the airport in Houston, Texas, and you look at the humanity there, it is just startling to me how many people are not just overweight, but significantly overweight. But yet I didn't hear any of you talk about personal responsibility. It's city planning, it's exercise. Of course, we need education about it, but there's no comment that I hear about portion control and that it's what you individually decide to put in your mouth. You all have a great bully pulpit. Have you thought about using it in terms of personal responsibility?
Well, I mean, I agree that, I don't know about journalists, but I mean, yes, getting the message of you have a stake in this, in your own health, is important for multiple diseases. But I think one of the best NPR stories I heard this past year, one of the most important, was part of their obesity series. They focused simply on the fact that why do doctors not even bring up the fact that a patient is overweight with their physician? So, I mean, the physician doesn't want to talk about it. It's just sort of this unsaid thing. They might address the high blood pressure. They might address the secondary impacts, but they were saying, you know, doctors need to bring this up with their patient, but there is a taboo, there's discomfort, there's fear of judgment. I think doctors, you know, culturally want to just address disease, and they don't want to judge their patients, they don't want to drive them away. So it's an uncomfortable topic, I think, but that is a place to start to address that, because obesity is a medical problem. So that could take some of the judgment out of it.
Please go ahead.
So I wanted to make a comment. I'm surprised that Judy missed what I thought I heard. And I thought I heard you, all the panelists, make some comment about the difficulties of reporting when you have economic interests that push back very strongly. And I wanted to thank Amy and CBS for an article that came out on the 60 Minutes last week on sugar. I watched this report on sugar, and last night I was at a function and there was some cake and I did not eat it. And this morning I'm drinking water and not the juice because I know it's got the sugar in it. And so what I want to say is that reports like that do have some impact, but it's really, really tough. And the question I have is, when you have economic interests that are so very, very significant, like the sugar industry or the whatever other industry is so interested in doing whatever they're doing, how is it that you guys can report in ways that will significantly influence our personal responsibility and not get shut down by your advertisers?
That's a great question, and I just want to make sure I make the point that even though we get tremendous pushback from the chemical industry regarding bisphenol A, from the sugar industry, the beverage industry, the beef industry, that does not dissuade us from reporting, and we still take it on. But as we would do, I guess, as responsible journalists, is seek out the different perspectives. I'm glad you enjoyed Dr. Lustig's point of view on sugar, which is quite extreme, but we do try to build in that balance. Bob, would you agree?
I think that the personal responsibility is a complicated story, because if you think about personal responsibility in smoking, for a long time there was plenty of evidence that smoking, which is an addictive substance, was very dangerous. But as I pointed out before, the tobacco industry was very successful at setting up an artificial dichotomy where there was 1,000 scientists who said it was causing cancer, and you had one person who said it wasn't, and then they would convince the congressperson to which they'd given a huge amount of money to say, well, it's just a question. It's still an open question. And it took some very brave individuals like Luther Terry, who was a Surgeon General in 1964, to come out with the report in the face of that pressure. So personal responsibility is great. People have information, but they also have other things that are influencing them. And sugar is a good example. I mean, because sugar is so cheap, fructose corn syrup, for instance, is put in a lot of stuff that people don't even know they're eating sugar. And because it makes it, nothing doesn't taste better with sugar. And so the personal responsibility is part of the story, but it's not that that people haven't gotten fat just because they're stupid or they are ignorant. They are, they're subjected to forces and stresses and to a lack of, as you pointed out, Carrie pointed out, an urban planning system that's set up to make people drive cars and not take public transportation. And and one of the people that's been most effective, even though he's one of the most personally arrogant and unpleasant people I've ever met in my life, is the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg. Everybody said, you can't get cigarette smoking out of restaurants and bars. They'll all close down. It'll be a horrible catastrophe for the industry. And he did it. He did it in New York, and when they did it in New York, it started to spread across the country. And now, even in Texas, you don't smoke people. You don't see people smoking in restaurants. It's become socially unacceptable. In Ireland and Italy, France, you have restaurants are now smoke-free. That is an enormous social change, and it's going to save millions of lives around the world. And it started with that act in New York. So yes, it's not always a medical thing that's going to come out of a petri dish in a laboratory, but it takes leadership. It takes leadership in journalism, in politics, and in science.
With that,
One place you will see a lot of smoking now is Africa, because people are getting the lifestyle messages here. So the big tobacco companies are spending the bulk of their marketing dollars in countries like Africa.
still an enormous problem in China as well. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Can I get a piece of this, please? I've been waiting for about 5 minutes way over here. You
Young man, go ahead.
You guys covered a lot of great topics, relatedness, conflicts of interest that we already just have been talking about, and I'm gonna blow off, you know, the myriad of drug company advertisings I see on the evening news. We'll just leave that for another time. But one thing that is interesting, you guys are teachers, you teach the public, and point of fact that you brought up was relatedness between two divergent stories. And I think a good center point is, and I know you guys are time constrained, and this is where CG comes in, computer graphics, is like, say, for example, here in Houston, we have been voted the fattest city in America again. And guess what? We're also the petrochemical energy capital of the world. Where is the point of relatedness between that, climate change, and urban planning? It's obvious. Fats, all they are is long-chained hydrocarbons. What are petrochemicals? That's a great way to segue into different sorts of stories. And I think you can find a big gold mine in the molecular biology, molecular mechanics, and do that by using CG. And I guess I'll just leave it at that. Appreciate it.
I would like to say, actually, there is a point in there that I think is extremely important. I think we have not taken on chemical additives sufficiently in the media. For example, don't repeat this because it's pre-embargo, but there's a big study coming out next week linking autism to obesity and type 2 diabetes. And is it the obesity itself, or is it the food coloring, the chemicals, the preservatives, the manufacturing components in our food that is potentially causing a lot of these problems? And I don't think we've taken that on, and I think we need more input from scientists to help us report that story.
Well, we'll end on that note. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope you did as well. Of course, I'm disappointed that you didn't pick my work, but we'll leave it at that.
It goes without saying that your work is brilliant and stands at the forefront of science, science and medicine.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our august panel.